Level 1. Low approval rating. If you've heard of Dina Boluarte at all, it's likely precisely for this. Throughout her 3-year presidency, from beginning to end, Dina Boluarte was chronically unpopular. Reaching a height at the start of her presidency of 21%, Dina Boluarte arrived at Peru's governmental palace, widely rejected and seen as illegitimate. Only 1 month later, her approval rating would fall amid scandals subsuming the Peruvian White House immediately upon Dina Boluarte's arrival. Rather than one political scandal in particular triggering her decline in already scant support, Dina Boluarte's rejection stems from a constant flow of corruption scandals, which will be discussed at length later in this video.
El momento en que esta persona estaba reclamando a la presidenta de la República, Dina Boluarte, por la muerte de un familiar durante las manifestaciones, recordemos, de diciembre del 2022 y enero del 2023. Ella le increpa la situación que está atravesando precisamente por la muerte de su ser querido.
Mataron a mi esposo, voy a estar tranquila yo. Pienso tratarte de la bienvenida. Su nombre.
Dina Boluarte's rejection stemmed from a constant flow of corruption scandals, which will later be discussed at length. I've attached some videos here to accurately portray her wide rejection by the public. More videos of such rejection will be sprinkled throughout the video. Dina Boluarte has also been famous for her gaffes. Like many politicians, Dina Boluarte didn't always say the right thing. I've attached some videos here to explain her image as a politician who was somewhat silly and couldn't really figure out what to say.
Le voy a agradecer.
Le voy a permitir, pero no soy jueza, soy presidente de sala.
Señora presidenta de sala, discúlpeme usted.
No, no soy señora, soy señor. Por lo visto no me está viendo. Deben conectarse a las...
Perdón, doctor Manuel Estuardo Luján, lo estoy viendo. Discúlpeme usted, señor juez, presidente de las salas.
Cuando se conecten tienen que estar viendo, porque de lo contrario parecería que están de otra manera. Le permito el tiempo que me ha pedido, pero no se extienda demasiado, tenemos varias audiencias pendientes.
De este curso de inglés. Good morning, Mrs. President Boluarte. We all are happy to visit you, that you visit us, and of course, we are so grateful of receiving this new school. Buenas tardes, buenos días y bienvenida, Presidenta Boluarte. Todos estamos muy contentos y alegres de recibir nuestro nuevo colegio y que también tenga ese compromiso con la educación pública. For that, we all want to say thank you.
Y escuchamos a Eduardo, él es joven estudiante de este centro educativo del taller de inglés.
A todos ustedes los felicito. Quería decir en inglés, pero todavía tengo...
Con 10 solcitos hacemos sopa, segundo y hasta postrecito, ¿cierto? Nos las inventamos. Así somos las mujeres. Hasta con 10 solcitos hacemos sopa, segundo y hasta postrecito, ¿cierto? Nos las inventamos. Así somos las mujeres, pero también acompañada de los compañeros que acompañan a ustedes. Pero un paro de 24 horas, 48 horas, hermano transportista, no resuelve y no va a resolver el problema. Todos tenemos que sumar. Las denuncias que lleguen a los celulares de estos extorsionadores, a la ciudadanía en general. No abran esas llamadas, no abran esos mensajes.
Unidos somos más fuertes frente al crimen. Para el 2025 se lograría concluir con mejoras 384 unidades de albergue de los institutos de Iquitos. Acá me han puesto EPE, no. Establecimiento penitenciario, ministro de Justicia. Establecimiento penitenciario de Iquitos y establecimiento penitenciario de Chimbote, con una inversión de 133.048 millones de soles.
Throughout her presidency, Dina Boluarte gained notoriety for not fulfilling the basic function of the presidency, actually being in the government palace. Despite persistent economic stagnation and civil unrest, Dina consistently saw fit to travel internationally rather than focus on struggles at home. It's important to note her predecessor was never permitted to leave the country. Trip to Brazil, August 7th to August 9th, 2023. In 2023, Peru faces a brutal recession. With 62 votes in favor and 32 against, and 7 abstentions, Dina Boluarte would be permitted to go on her first trip to Brazil. This is controversial because historically, vice presidents would assume the role of the president while the presidents were abroad. Dina carved out a digital exception made during COVID. Politicians like Jorge Montoya say that Dina Boluarte should be impeached for such a trip. Dina pledges to fight against illegal mining and logging during this time, and she mentions she's the first female president of Peru. Lula and Marina Silva look confused and even bored by her speech. The president of Congress says this trip was necessary to quote-unquote normalize things and promote investment. Trip to the United States, September 17th to September 21st, 2023. This is where it really starts to become clear that Dina Boluarte's trips abroad frankly don't serve the needs of Peruvians. The president was accompanied by 7 other people, all of whom would see their trips paid for by the government. The event was widely protested by those who thought that she was using the trip as a way of escaping scandals at home. As a product of this trip, Congress needed to find a way to justify why they authorized such a vacation. Norma Yarro, for instance, requested documentation detailing the activities of the event. The trip cost $86,206.50. Trip to the Vatican, October 11th to October 15th of 2023. This trip is perhaps one of Dina Boluarte's most infamous trips, not in small part due to the date in which it took place. Only 4 days after the infamous October 7th attacks, at the time, Peruvians in Israel were afraid of some sort of follow-up attack by Hamas or an escalation of war. There were 3 Peruvians who were killed during the attack. The response from the federal government at the time was to say, "We'll send over some planes." But this was only after people had made a stir about the inaction from the government. And most importantly, it was after October 11th, that is to say, several days after the initial October 7th attack, and most importantly for Dina, days after her trip to the Vatican had ended. It's also worth noting that Brazil had already announced it was going to send evacuation planes by the 8th, and Argentina had done so by the 10th. It appeared that a photo op with the Pope was getting in the way of helping her constituents. They attempted to put all the blame on the ambassador Manuel Cacho Sousa, but there hasn't been any coverage of errors on his part, and it seemed like a broader strategy of scapegoating on part of the federal government. It didn't help that it was frankly obvious that this trip served more as a vacation for the president. She went to Germany, not to meet with the chancellor, but seemingly to take photos with local German mayor Frank Knopper from Stuttgart. Imagine, for instance, Joe Biden, or Obama, or George Bush meeting with the mayor of Trujillo, Peru. And you can tell the majority of Peruvians didn't think it was a valuable use of time, not only because Dina's approval rating continued to fall after such an event, but also because the trip was widely protested. In the official Twitter account for the presidency of Peru, Dina posted these images with a description of the alleged benefits this trip was going to bring to the country. The comments are absolutely filled to the brim of people asking why their tax dollars were being spent on such an event. And it should be noted that Frank Knopper himself did not post the event, only Dina, which made Dina look desperate. Dina Boluarte was accompanied by 12 people for this trip. This trip would cost $155,126.84. Trip to the United States, November 1st to November 4th of 2023, for the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. We have arrived now at Dina Boluarte's 4th time in 4 months requesting to leave the country, this time accompanied by 22 people. Dina Boluarte uses the same excuse for every single trip she goes on, saying that they are used to promote investment. Political theater ensues in Congress, as congressmen say that Dina's international trips have no purpose, but end up voting for them anyway.
Esta declaración del congresista Alejandro Aguinaga, que fue por lo menos en lo particular una de las que más me sorprendió. Él tuvo palabras muy duras y bastante críticas en contra del viaje de la presidenta Dina Boluarte, pero Fuerza Popular terminó votando a favor de este viaje. ¿Qué le parece si recordamos esta intervención? Porque quería escuchar su comentario al respecto. Vamos a escucharlo.
Este viajecito, mediante el cual a los altos funcionarios del Estado los conquistan y prácticamente los envuelven teniéndolos de rehenes. Hoy día enfrentamos una nueva situación. Vemos a la novicia voladora que prefiere estar en la nube, lejos de la realidad que acontece en el país, cuando debiera estar acá, conduciendo el gabinete para poder solucionar aquí en la tierra los problemas gravísimos que vienen golpeando a la sociedad nacional. Que se prefiere estar en el aire, extraída de los gravísimos problemas que golpean a la sociedad, extraída de los problemas económicos que golpean fuertemente. Vemos una recesión tremenda que estamos viviendo en estos momentos, pero se prefiere, señor presidente, estar en el aire, ahí de manera etérea, extraída del compromiso que se ha asumido para poder conducir los destinos de la nación.
O sea, con esta intervención, lo lógico hubiera sido marcar
este viaje
en contra congresista Anderson.
Totalmente. Y es lo que yo he puesto en mi tweet, ¿no? Justamente, esto es no solamente incoherencia, ¿no? Yo creo que es de vergüenza, sinceramente. Por eso es que los políticos, pues, no generan ningún tipo de respeto, ¿no? Porque si dices A y haces Z, porque lo que crees, ¿no? Es que lo único que se va a propagar es justamente el discurso, ¿no?
This trip would become infamous because Dina Boluarte would claim that she had a bilateral discussion with former US President Joe Biden during her visit to the States in her official request to Congress. The only issue was that this was, yet again, completely made up. Dina Boluarte barely managed to approach the president for a few moments, and after that, someone promptly took a photo. Immediately, Dina took advantage of this and posted these photos in order to show her alleged closeness with then US President Joe Biden. The photo was obviously taken in an informal manner during the conference, where they took a photo together for only a few seconds. People began to wonder, what gives? Didn't she say the point of the trip was a formal meeting with US President Joe Biden? How is she going to justify the issue of her saying that she needed to travel to meet with Joe Biden when the most she could muster was to pull him aside for a quick photo op? Well, her cabinet ended up coming forth and making a statement saying that although there was an official bilateral meeting planned, they couldn't end up going through with the meeting because Biden's time was cut short that day. 1. There was no meeting planned on America's part because it was never on the White House schedule. 2. There was no meeting planned on Dina Boluarte's own presidential schedule. And 3. Even if it were true, would that make the situation better or make it worse? If your country had a bilateral meeting with another nation, and it was blown off because the president was tired, wouldn't that be infuriating, potentially embarrassing? Apparently, Dina's cabinet did not think so. Put plainly, this trip did not accomplish anything, and it cost $32,120. Trip to the USA, November 14th to November 18th of 2023. For Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. These types of trips are more or less standard for Peruvian presidents, so this one didn't generate as much controversy as some other trips. It must be said that the media, who was then in favor of the president, did much work to exaggerate the perceived benefits of the trip, but it was really quite procedural, and again, it seemed that nothing major was accomplished during this trip. This trip would cost $69,889. Trip to China from June 23rd to June 30th of 2024. In June of 2024, it was at this time that Dina Boluarte traveled to China, allegedly to promote diplomatic and commercial relations, and yes, quote-unquote, promote investment. After first exiting the presidential plane, some took a candid photo of her in her casual clothing, which quickly went viral and became a national meme. While it is understandable that someone would want to get nice and cozy on the 24-hour-long flight between Lima and Beijing, doing so on what is supposed to be an official government trip representing the country of Peru diplomatically could have negative ramifications, such as a lack of appropriate dress being seen as a sign of disrespect to the Chinese.
De Perú en Francia.
Además es una falta de respeto llegar a encontrarse con el embajador, con los funcionarios, con sus funcionarios, nuestros funcionarios, en esa facha. Sí entiendo que necesitaba comodidad para viajar, etc. Hay mil maneras. Un pantalón largo, sencillo, si quiere ir en blusa o en blusón, un camisero, una camisa de estas grandes.
While every Peruvian is well aware of this photo, only some are aware that she is planted right next to the French ambassador to Peru. This could again be perceived as inappropriate and trigger diplomatic issues. The first activity Dina Boluarte partook in was the opening ceremony for the Los Incas Museum in Shenzhen. It was there that Dina Boluarte attempted to make her first speech of the tour, where her Minister of Foreign Relations had to remind her that the audience in China did not, in fact, know Spanish.
Canciller peruano y quería hablar de largo.
Hermanas y hermanos de esta hermosa ciudad de Shenzhen, como presidenta constitucional de la República del Perú.
Algo pasó. Dina Boluarte no se esperaba una interrupción. La emoción le embargó y olvidó un pequeño gran detalle. Los presentes no sabían español. El ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, Javier González Olaichea, corrió al auxilio.
Afterwards, there was yet another controversy from the president since, while she was abroad, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake in Arequipa, Peru, and her response would only come 7 hours after the event had already occurred. This response, too, left room to be desired, because she was seen sleeping during the dialogue on earthquake relief in the area. Questions arose also of conflicts of interest. While researching this topic, I found claims that Dina Boluarte met with Chinese companies sanctioned in Peru for illegal activity. These would be public companies from the Chinese government. Her and her brother, as well as some of her political allies, would face investigations for receiving bribes from Chinese companies, and trips like these did little to assuage public distrust in her leadership. What was perhaps remembered the most from this trip was Dina Boluarte's interview with the Chinese press. Given that the interview was scripted, it struck the Peruvian population that, even under controlled circumstances, the president was unable to speak on any policy issues in an intelligent way. Rather, large parts of the interview were dedicated to talking about Chinese food and Chinese restaurants in Peru.
Casi en todo el Perú, no hay una región en el Perú que no tenga sus chifas. Y los chifas, a todos los peruanos nos encanta el chifa. ¿Y cuál es mi plato favorito? Es el pollo enrollado con calú guantán y por supuesto mis guantanes con el dulce de tamarindo. Y además hay una situación medio graciosa, pero como que es así. Dice, si vamos a comer chifa, tiene que ser acompañada de nuestra Inca Cola, que es una bebida gaseosa. Así es que chifa, Inca Cola es almuerzo
agradable y asegurado que nadie se va a quejar.
The trip was estimated to have cost $53,439.75. Trip to Switzerland, January 20th to January 24th of 2025. It was at this date that Dina travels to Switzerland to speak at the World Economic Forum. Yes, the one that has inspired insane conspiracy theories about people seizing everything that we own. This trip, however, was not nearly as outrageous as such claims, but it was a part of a broader pattern of Dina's international tours, not necessarily serving any purpose to the Peruvian public. She was accompanied by 5 people, and it cost $29,952. On arrival, Dina Boluarte found herself being protested, yet again, by Peruvians living abroad, as well as anyone else who was outraged by her presidency. Trip to the Vatican, from May 16th to May 29th, 2025. After her first trip to the Vatican resulted in some less than stellar reactions at home, Dina was given a unique opportunity with the ascension of the new Pope, Pope Leo. There was just one problem. The new Pope had spent years living in Peru and had already denounced Dina Boluarte's violent crackdown on protesters as president, and said they caused profound sadness and pain. This, in my opinion, explains why Dina Boluarte's approval rating continued to take a sharp dip downwards. In a Catholic country, having the Pope denounce you means quite a bit to the citizens there, even if she was already very unpopular at the time. This trip was also protested. There is a general sense of desperation that is present in all of Dina's international tours whenever she meets a leader. Like she's sort of trying to be considered a legitimate president because she was not thought of one by many Peruvians. You can see this when she's shaking Pope Leo's hand. It seems like she doesn't really want to let it go. It's also worth noting that while meeting Pope Leo, she re-gifted him a cross that she had received from the governor of the state of Lambayeque. If Dina Boluarte really shares a profound connection with the Catholic faith, like she has said, wouldn't she be more considerate so as to not re-gift to the Pope someone who she should consider a key messenger of God? Also should be worth noting that a Peruvian journalist actually did the due diligence of following Boluarte, and you can see her here awkwardly trying to avoid press interaction.
Dimmi che è l'ultimo, Maria Paola, dimmi che è l'ultimo. Attenzione per favore, attenzione. Ok, embajador.
Presidenta, ¿cuáles fueron sus palabras para el Perú con el Papa? ¿Nos podría comentar cuáles son sus palabras? Por favor, estamos en vivo para RPP. Presidenta, unas palabras para el Perú sobre la reunión con el Papa. Canciller, unas palabras para el Perú sobre...
Muy emocionados todos, la presidenta con el Papa, muy emocionados, muchas gracias.
Gracias, hasta luego. Permiso, hasta luego. Okay.
At the time of the exchange, she hadn't spoken with the Peruvian press for over 200 days. It was just before this trip that Dina Boluarte sang happy birthday to the Pope, yet another governmental event that people would consider not serious and a waste of taxpayer funds. This trip to the Vatican cost $17,613.58. Trip to Ecuador, May 24th of 2025. This trip was Dina Boluarte's most austere, only having been over the course of one day. This trip is not necessarily problematic, although it is odd that the new Ecuadorian president would want Dina Boluarte at his inauguration, given that she was very unpopular and not every single regional leader was invited. On the whole, however, it was a standard trip. This trip cost $5,000. Trip to France, June 7th to June 11th of 2025. This was for the United Nations Oceans Conference of 2025. There are 2 problems with this trip. 1, Dina is never heard speaking intelligently in any manner about Peru's oceans on the trip. There is a very interesting history behind European companies mistreating Peru's oceans, which never comes up during Dina's trip to France. At the time of the trip, there were massive protests at home over pension reforms that would see a cut in assistance to Peru's older population. The trip was seen as a way for her to escape rising political scandal like her other international trips had been perceived in the past. This trip cost $19,390. Trip to Japan and Indonesia from August 5th to August 12th of 2025. This trip took place around the time that Trump's Liberation Day tariffs came into effect, with Peru getting slapped with a baseline 10% tariff. During this trip, there was an agreement that was signed for the lowering of tariffs on Peruvian goods entering Indonesia and vice versa. The Japanese half of the trip would seem to be less productive, with very little occurring over the course of her time in Japan. Again, it was perceived by the public as an attempt for Dina to escape political scandal at home and go on vacation. This trip would generate controversy for its cost of around $129,000. Trip to America from September 21st to September 25th of 2025. This was the fourth time in the year of 2025 alone that she had left the country. While her government faced yet another crisis, with her Minister of Security, Juan José Santibáñez, recently censured, Dina Boluarte would see fit to travel to the United States. This trip gains infamy, however, because it is the second time Dina Boluarte has failed to pause throughout her speech to facilitate translation. This led to Dina Boluarte's microphone being cut off at the United Nations.
Con recursos públicos, proyectos para afianzar la autonomía económica de las mujeres. Informo que el matrimonio infantil fue abolido en el año 2023. Señora Presidenta, como la primera mujer presidenta en más de
Muchas gracias.
She was accompanied by 7 people, and the trip cost $23,000. This was the last time that Dina Boluarte would travel abroad before being impeached. Dina's broken promise. You may be wondering, okay, maybe not the best president, but I don't really understand why such a low approval rating. This should give some important context. Even before Dina Boluarte assumed power, Peru was going through a prolonged political crisis. In order to understand the situation in its totality, we do have to quickly go over some history. Historically in Latin America, the period of the 1980s was marked by hyperinflation caused by global recession, among other factors like higher interest rates in the United States and a drop in the prices of commodities. Where Peruvians faced a decade of hyperinflation as well as armed communist groups that inflicted a reign of terror against the population. In the 1990s, dictatorship came into effect, the 10-year government of Alberto Fujimori. After cooling Peru's inflation to single digits after it had been in the tens of thousands, the dictator sent the military in on Congress, henceforth granting him autocratic control until 2001, when he was ousted via revolution. From 2001 to 2016, Peru was characterized by a centrist, then center-right, then center-left government. Because of a recession brought upon by the slowing economy in China, as well as in India, the year of 2015 marks a shift towards conservatism, not only in Peru, but across the continent. Lo and behold, Peru has elections in 2016, and who is running in those elections? The daughter of the country's former dictator, Keiko Fujimori. This meant that all of the macroeconomic conditions were set for Keiko to have a massive victory, until her vice president got a DEA investigation opened on him for drug trafficking and money laundering, meaning she'd lose the election by less than a percentage point, but have an absolute majority in Congress with over 70 seats. And, making a long story incredibly short, Keiko would go through a series of political impeachments in order to attempt to install a puppet president. Then came the elections of 2021, and this is where Dina Boluarte comes in. It's the election, and wouldn't you know it, the right-wing candidate is once again the daughter of the previous dictator, Keiko Fujimori. And the left-wing candidate is a populist called Pedro Castillo. His vice president? Dina Boluarte. And because there had already been several politicized impeachments, Dina had made a promise to the public, saying that if Castillo had been impeached, she would renounce her role as VP and pass the torch to someone else in Congress. But there were some warning signs that a clean break from politics wasn't going to happen. For one, She was expelled from her political party, Peru Libre, after saying she never embraced the quote-unquote hardline ideology present in much of the party. Relations between her and Pedro Castillo were reportedly extremely distant, with Castillo not including Dina in his inner circle and giving her the role of Minister of Development and Social Inclusion, while his Prime Minister, Betsy Chavez, had a much bigger say in his administration and functioned as his VP in practice. According to the journalist Christopher Acosta, tensions were so fraught between the two of them that at one point Castillo had attempted to fire Dina from her role as Minister of Development and Social Inclusion, but had backed out after Dina Boluarte broke out in tears and said that this is what her family lives off of, that she wouldn't know what to do if she didn't have this job. Castillo would confirm the story a year later. So, did Dina Boluarte renounce her role as vice president? No. Castillo was impeached, and then Dina happily enters into the presidential palace wearing the iconic red and white sash and assumes the role as president. This is the biggest explanation for why she was so unpopular, because no president benefits from a presidential campaign of saying, I won't be president, or I don't want to be president, or I want to renounce the role of the presidency. In order to not be impeached, Dina Boluarte would have to obey the orders of Congress. And who has the largest political party in Congress? It would yet again be Keiko Fujimori. So, while conservative right-wingers in Peru remember Dina as Keiko's opposition during the presidential campaign, left-wing Peruvians consider her an opportunist. One of the principal quote-unquote scandals from the previous president is the personal use of the government palace, the Peruvian equivalent to the White House, for personal use. Congress at the time had been so eager to impeach the previous president that the image of him having a picnic on the government premises inspired calls for removal. Something that is glaringly obvious is the double standard with which Congress treated Dina versus her predecessor. Because Dina Boluarte, too, would use the government palace for her own personal enjoyment on an even more regular basis than Castillo did. On May 31st of 2023, Dina Boluarte celebrated her 61st birthday amidst traditional Apurimeña performers, that is, performers from her home state in the south of Peru, Apurímac. Dina, on the same day of her birthday, partook in the annual multi-hazard drill. Think fire hazards, earthquakes, stop, drop, and roll. So, this event only lasted for about an hour, and the rest of the day was spent basically not really doing much and celebrating her birthday. But with the justification of this quote-unquote multi-hazard drill, she was able to delay a court date responding to inquiries from the public prosecutor's office while she spent the day dancing. For May 31st of 2024, there was a nationwide protest against Dina on her 62nd birthday. Called a cacerolazo, or a pots and pans protest, it's a type of protest in Latin America where the public bangs pots or pans in public, stemming from middle-class protests in Chile during the 1970s. Under the democratic socialist leadership of Salvador Allende, hyperinflation ran rampant in Chile, and banging pots and pans became a symbolically significant way of saying, there's no food, look at our pots, they are empty. It's logistically easy because most families own pots and pans in their homes. It's safe because you can often engage in this kind of protest from your balcony. And it's obviously loud, showing that people are unwilling to be ignored. So what did Dina do on her birthday while she was being protested by the public? Well, we don't really know. While birthdays can serve as days to make some sort of announcement or ceremony, or announce some sort of infrastructure project, there was no publicly documented presidential agenda for the day, and Dina made no public appearances. Had she not been president, she could have been celebrating her birthday like any other, but she found herself on what is supposed to be the happiest day of the year, hiding from the general public. It's a tragic image of the president in a hell of her own making. She did, that day, however, find time to send an official request to Congress to authorize her iconic trip to China that we had previously discussed. Dina's birthday party on May 31st of 2025, her 63rd birthday, would see the arrival of various cabinet members with gifts in hand, some of whom were undergoing investigations for criminal activity at the time. This will be expanded on later in the Iceberg. It's worth noting that this event was not listed on the presidential agenda and was done in a discreet manner. They arrived with cars with tinted windows. There was a certain secretness to the party, with each minister getting their phones confiscated from them upon entrance. This raised questions like, were they afraid of information about the event getting leaked to the public? Why? With so many corrupt ministers joining her secret birthday party, it raised suspicions of corruption. Overall, Dina's birthday parties serve as a useful snapshot of the type of president she really was, and are broadly symbolic of the political dynamics during her time in office. Double standards between her and Castillo, Dina's inability to face the public, and Dina's alleged corruption and lack of transparency. While Dina eventually ascended to the role of vice president, she initially worked as a mid-level bureaucrat in Peru's RENIEC, the government agency responsible for handing out national identity cards and birth certificates. Immediately before assuming the role of vice president, Dina requested a 5-year leave of absence from the agency, which RENIEC denied, as it's custom to resign from these roles before assuming a position as important as the one of vice presidency in the presidency. Boluarte, as president, then sued RENIEC in order to procure $250,000 soles in what she considered to be funds that were owed to her that she never collected from the agency. While she did win the case, there were a few issues that people took with this event. As the president, there's obviously going to be at least the appearance of conflicts of interest, meaning that if someone approved this deposit of $250,000 soles, they could get some sort of benefit from Boluarte in return. 2, created the appearance of Dina having double roles, double dipping on government salaries, and using her positions as a way to enrich herself rather than focus on the duties of the presidency. 3rd, the case was handled in a very quick manner, which is not characteristic of most RENIEC lawsuits. There are many other Peruvians who had been fighting for their pensions that hadn't received them. This created the image of a backdoor deal, with Dina talking to someone and allegedly getting her case handled right away. Someone watching this may be asking, what if she really needed the money from this institution? What if her being denied her leave of absence really could affect her personal financial situation? Well, it seems unlikely that this is the case, because she made other efforts throughout her presidency to increase her official salary. She not only raised the presidential wage, but also used a state credit card in order to quote-unquote cover typical monthly expenses. With all these instances combined, it becomes clear that Dina had leveraged the state to increase her own personal wealth whenever the opportunity arose. Diversity hire and the rise of Dina. How exactly did she gain power to begin with? As in, how did she get the role of the vice presidency from the Peruvian elections in 2021? The leader of her political party, Vladimir Cerrón, remember this name, was the big boss when it came to making decisions on party organization. Pedro Castillo was who Cerrón picked to be the presidential figure for a few reasons. 1, Cerrón was incapable of running for the presidency due to legal issues. You can look forward to hearing more about these. 2, Castillo had the image of being more moderate than Cerrón, which had the potential to bring in hesitant voters. 3, Castillo was a union leader who had taken part in prolific demonstrations against previous corrupt presidents. This explains how Castillo got the role of the presidency, but what about Dina to the vice presidency? An important consideration was that they didn't want 2 strong personalities vying for the role of the presidency, especially given the number of impeachments that had already occurred. They wanted someone with a low profile, as opposed to Castillo, who had already been a prominent union leader, and Dina had worked as a mid to low-level bureaucrat. There needed to be someone who, let's say, wasn't particularly charismatic or well-known among the public, so that there wasn't a rivalry for the role of the presidency. This is all quite ironic, considering that Dina and Castillo would eventually end up hating one another. And finally, Cerrón himself admitted that he picked Dina because he quote-unquote wanted a woman to be the one to occupy the position. With the far-right presidential opponent being a woman, they tend to perform slightly better with women than men. The whole affair casts a pretty dim light on identity politics and the box checking that is done a lot of the time in order to accumulate votes among the widest demographic possible. Perhaps, maybe, in an alternate universe, things like political expertise and the most empirically backed reforms were the focus instead of trying to court votes. Perhaps Peru would have been a better place after Castillo's impeachment. Just maybe. Club Departamental de Apurímac. From the 1940s to the 2000s, and even this day to some extent, Peru saw itself transition from a mostly agricultural society to a more industrial society. It's worth mentioning as well that agricultural work was physically intensive and often rife with abuse and low pay. That meant a lot of agricultural workers from rural parts of the country would move to Lima over the course of decades in the hopes of finding a better life and providing for their families. This internal migration is felt to this day in a variety of complex ways that merit their own video. When internal migrants come to Lima, they can participate in or create what are called clubes departamentales, or departmental clubs, given that the name for what would be states here in the United States are called departments in Peru. Think of it like if there was an economic crisis in the middle of the country, groups of people from Oklahoma or Wyoming creating clubs for one another in New York City or Chicago. Dina Boluarte actually participated in one of these clubs, the Club Departamental de Apurímac, or the State Apurímac Club. It's here when we get our first glimpses into signs of corruption from Dina Boluarte and an omen of what was to come. The first instance of rule bending was when the departmental club for Apurímac operated without having a license, first seen by some as excessive rule obsession. A high informal sector in Peru means that operating without a license is not necessarily seen as a grave infraction. However, this would foreshadow what was to come as more and more instances of suspicious activity and corrupt activity at this club would begin to arise. The abuse of power that Dina Boluarte exercised at this club would be an indication of her leadership style. Instead of using this club for its intended purpose, a good one, helping migrants acclimate to city life, preserving culture, forming a sense of bonding and community, allegations of improper behavior began to pop up. It's here that we see signs of the mini-corrupt dictator that Dina Boluarte would become. Instead of using the club for its intended purpose, helping migrants acclimate to city life, preserving culture, and forming a sense of bonding and community, multiple witnesses testified that Dina had done something which is unfortunately all too common in these clubs. She used it as a way to campaign for the political party she belonged to.
Para situaciones políticas el club no se utiliza. Es una institución apolítica, digamos, ¿no? Pero sí, yo personalmente cuando he ido he visto hasta la secretaria con chaquetas del partido, ¿no? Cosa que... De Perú Libre. De Perú Libre, ¿no? Reuniones que hacían, ¿no? Está prohibido, en realidad.
Not only that, but the club also began to get more strict about collecting fees, with up to 60% of club members being excluded for not paying their quotas, many of whom alleged they were never even notified that they were behind on paying said quotas.
Fue expulsada de manera arbitraria junto a decenas de socios por oponerse a la gestión de Dina Boluarte como presidenta del club.
Ya después de su primera gestión, algunos socios no estuvimos de acuerdo con el manejo que ella tenía con el club. Se religió entonces los que, no diríamos oposición, los que no les caíamos bien, como ella es abogada de profesión, entonces vio que nosotros habíamos dejado de pagar, en el caso mío le hablo, 2 meses que implican 20 soles, ¿no? Entonces buscó la excusa para sacarnos a muchos socios.
Según se lee en este documento elaborado por un grupo de ex socios del Club Departamental Apurímac que presentarán ante el Ministerio Público, la presidenta Dina Boluarte, sin proceso disciplinario alguno y sin respetar el debido proceso, ha excluido al 60% de asociados por el motivo de no estar al día en sus cuotas. Sin embargo, el estatuto de la institución señala que solo se sanciona con la expulsión a los socios que dejen de pagar sus cuotas mensuales por más de un año consecutivo y tras un proceso en el Tribunal de Honor en segunda instancia.
¿Cómo es que me saca de de la institución por no haber pagado 2 meses. En tal caso, primero hay un tema de prevención que se me debió comunicar. A mí y a todos los exjuizados, somos un montón.
In order to facilitate these changes in the departmental club of Apurímac, she allegedly maintained a sentimental relationship with the president of the club, Juan Olazabal Segovia, also a way to not be reprimanded for her behavior. Later, Juan Segovia and his family would be hired by the state. Although Dina said that all of these investigations into her corruption were simply the cause of an abuse of power by the prosecutor's office, several people testified that Dina and Juan maintained a sentimental relationship during her time in the departmental club of Apurímac, with some highlighting a culture of gift-giving to Boluarte that took place at this club. But if this wasn't enough proof of a clear conflict of interest, leaked chats would confirm a sentimental relationship between the two. Dina Boluarte's lawyer would defend her by saying, "If a loving fan of Dina wants to gift her a gift, what's the harm in that?" There would later be even more proof of this pipeline between the departmental club of Apurímac and gaining government contracts when it was revealed that the president met with several members of this family in a secret Mykonos apartment complex, who all ended up with government jobs, with one even meeting Xi Jinping. Dina sometimes mentions being from Chalhuanca, Apurímac, to make herself seem more authentic, but interestingly enough, owed a debt of 17,000 soles to her local community. The money was earned via a fundraising event in 2019, when Dina Boluarte had recently begun working as a public official to rebuild the local church in the town square of Chalhuanca. But after gaining access to said money, it was held in a bank account that belonged to a colleague of hers, the president of the departmental club of Chalhuanca, William Segarra Pandegoso. She then later retrieved the money in cash with the help of Victor Torres Merino, who was later hired in Dina Boluarte's Ministry of Social Development. The money was given back to authorities in Chalhuanca after the issue became a public scandal in 2023. Congress had been preparing her disqualification from partaking in politics altogether as a result of this infraction. But just as it had appeared that Boluarte was going to get the boot, as many of her other party members had, the Commission for Constitutional Accusations had archived her case, letting her get off scot-free. This was only 2 days before ex-President Castillo would attempt to close Congress. It appeared that this was the event that led her to negotiate her ascension to the presidency, as it became clear that Castillo was on borrowed time. Dina's family. For the family segment, I wanted to talk about her family situation, how she grew up, and the role that her family held while she was in government. Dina Boluarte is the youngest of 14 children. Her parents were Nicanor Boluarte Roman and Petronila Ercilia Segarra Pimentel. This means that Dina Boluarte has in total 28 nieces and nephews. It's hard to find information on some of these family members, given that some are not public figures, but I did my best to construct a rough outline of what Dina Boluarte's upbringing looked like. Her life story. Dina Boluarte grew up in Chalhuanca, Aymares, Apurímac. Chalhuanca is a quaint city situated along the Apurímac River. Its name stems from the Quechua words chalwa and the suffix unca, meaning fish, and the second meaning place of fishing. Here, you can see the city's flag and coat of arms. The city usually has a cool temperature in the nights and early mornings, hovering between the 40s and the 50s in Fahrenheit temperature, but warms up as the sun comes closer to the city, around 70 degrees. The rainy season is from around November to April, and the dry season from May to September. The coldest months tend to be during this dry season, as temperatures cool more dramatically during the nighttime. Cultural festivities include its annual carnival, dedicated to the souls in purgatory. This is said to bring good luck and to purge bad energy. Its geographical location makes it an ideal location for mining and fishing, as well as agriculture. which comprised the majority of Chalhuanca's economic activity. Its hot spring and gorgeous mountain structures could serve as a good tourist destination, but it is still quite isolated geographically. The history of the town is difficult to pin down. The only photos I found of the town when Dina Boluarte was growing up during the 60s and 70s show a Chalhuanca less developed than it is today, and one of a bridge used for fishing that remains in use for that very purpose to this day. It's difficult to know whether her humble upbringing motivated her interest in politics, as she states, or whether the two were unconnected and she used her humble upbringing as a tool to gain political sympathy. After finishing high school, she would temporarily move to Sonora, Mexico, where she would complete her undergraduate degree. It was not uncommon for Peruvians to go to university in Mexico in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because options in Peru had been quite poor, and at the time, Mexico offered generous scholarship programs. It was around the year of 1992 when Dina Boluarte had her first child, born in Mexico. It was thought that it was around the late 90s to early 2000s that Dina Boluarte would return to Peru, not in Chalhuanca, but in the capital city of Lima. It's here when we enter the role that Dina Boluarte's family had while she was in government. Dina Boluarte's government has been accused of engaging in rank nepotism on various occasions. An example of this can be found when, for example, Dina Boluarte's niece, Yorka Boluarte, was hired to the Ministry of Education when she was vice president. She earned around 80,000 soles, or around $23,000. It's worth highlighting all the nieces and nephews who received nepotistic treatment. In total, there are 7 of them who were hired by some sort of state entity, potentially more. There's Victoria Boluarte, who worked in the Ministry of Education alongside Yorka Boluarte in 2022. Victoria Boluarte would again receive employment from the state in 2023 when she was hired in the Ministry of Education for 54,000 soles. Victoria Boluarte would later be subject to an investigation from the Comptroller's Office for the crime of incompatible negotiation, a type of conflict of interest and improper interest in contracts. There's Marco Antonio Boluarte, who was hired by the regional government of Apurímac, Dina's home state. He never worked for the government before Dina's ascension in politics. Krupskaya Boluarte, professor at Huancavelica University, also benefited from state contracts while Dina was president and vice president. Jare Boluarte was hired in the regional government of Cusco. Shadia Boluarte was also hired in the Ministry of Education in 2022, earning 22,500 soles. The Ministry of Education seemed to be the State Department with most nepotistic activity, with Shadia Boluarte also being hired in the Ministry of Education in 2022, earning 22,500 soles. There's Jose David Ugarte Boluarte, who was granted a position in the state-run water company Sedapal in Cusco, despite being an anthropologist with no work experience in sanitation or government. This is considered to be the most egregious case of nepotism because 3 months before his ascension into said role, a new job title was created, and then later promptly occupied by Jose Boluarte. This was in February of 22, when Dina Boluarte was still vice president. When asked about what qualifications he held to occupy such a role, he responded that he went to many speaking events on the subject matter. An investigation into excess appointments would later be opened by the prosecutor's office. It's worth noting as well that this was not the only instance of corruption involving Jose Boluarte. An NGO associated with him would be rewarded by Boluarte's MINCUL, or Ministry of Culture. This appointment was made by Jorge Luis Ortiz, who would later be investigated for corruption and nepotism. Another case of nepotism was noted when Dina Boluarte's nephew Carlos Chong Campana benefited from a contract done by the Fund for Police Housing through a company associated with him called KCS Insurance Brokers. It was cause for alarm when, after these revelations were made public, the company deleted all mentions of Carlos Campana from their social media accounts. It's worth noting that Carlos Campana was a chief of police when Dina Boluarte was vice president. One of the most infamous scandals from this era was the Juan Silva case, where the Minister of Transportation from July of 2021 to February of 2022 was accused of procuring bribes in exchange for favorable construction contracts. And yes, you heard that right. he was only Minister of Transportation for a shockingly quick 6-month period. Immediately after he was dismissed, the prosecutor's office would open an investigation against him and call for his preventative detention. At the time of his escape, the chief of state security was Carlos Campana, raising suspicions on a potential scheme of bribery in the National Police Force under Dina Boluarte's political party and during her vice presidency. While this hasn't been proven, it raises serious concerns about corruption. You may remember Dina Boluarte's brother becoming a topic of conversation earlier in the video. Remember the name Nicanor Boluarte because it's going to appear several times in this video and is one of the key factors behind Dina Boluarte's low approval ratings. Nicanor Boluarte has also received nepotistic treatment when Dina Boluarte was vice president, earning 99,000 soles between June and September of 2020, also in the Ministry of Education. While it's possible that not all of these hirings were the result of corruption, most notably at the local level, it's apparent that there was a culture cultivated in the Ministry of Education during Dina's presidency and vice presidency that rewarded nepotistic connections over pure qualifications. Dina Boluarte's education minister, Morgan Caro, would attempt to do some damage control, saying that Dina's brother isn't pulling any strings or fostering a nepotistic culture in the Ministry of Education, only to later join the political party of Dina Boluarte's brother. This did little to restore public confidence. It's worth noting that Dina Boluarte's sister was granted a position in the Junta Nacional de Justicia, or the Board of Magistrates in Peru, as an advisor. And let's not forget about Dina Boluarte's eldest son and his girlfriend, who were both given seats as secretaries to the United Nations. Given how unpopular Dina Boluarte was, reaching an approval rating of only 2% by the end of her administration, it shouldn't surprise you that some of Dina's own family members began to disavow her government. And surprisingly, it would come from Yorka Boluarte, one of Dina Boluarte's nieces hired in the Ministry of Education. She vehemently denies any wrongdoing. Her written message to Boluarte would resonate, despite, or perhaps because of, her familial proximity to Boluarte. Dear Aunt Dina, I never thought I was going to write this. It's been 10 years since the last time we've talked, but because of the situation the country finds itself in today, with the deaths of innocents in the streets and the dissemination of lies in the press that threaten my standing, I feel obligated to write to you. For these reasons, and because I believe I have the moral authority to do so, I have this to say. When the crisis began to intensify between the executive and congressional branch in 2021 and 2022, I still believed that in the event that you assumed the presidency, given that you were the vice president of a president who was constantly targeted by Congress, you would do so with the integrity and composure demanded by the people, keeping in mind your roots, the implications it would have for the country, for the women of this country, and for those who believed in you. When the moment came, I believed you would swear yourself to the Constitution, declare your government as a transitional one, and would immediately call for new general elections in tune with what the country wanted. The times in which we lived would call upon you to conduct yourself with responsibility, keeping in mind the democratic institutions of this country, strengthening dialogue, and fighting against corruption. It was the bare minimum that even our last president did not dare to do. It was exactly the opposite. You crossed over to the other side, you swore yourself president until 2026, another 4 years. You established your alliance with sectors of society which only hours before had called you a leftist terrorist and a thug, and had denounced you in the strongest possible terms. Do you remember where we came from? Your parents, my grandparents, they were honorable people from Chahuanca and Mares, Apurimac. My grandfather, an honest judge, and my grandmother, a hardworking and dignified woman dedicated to her 12 children, who gave her grandchildren that she too helped raise. I still remember when you were much younger, when I was just a child, sharing a space under the same roof with my parents in Cusco. Do you remember bringing home 2 vinyl records from Tiempo Nuevo? We sang songs like Cierra Filas and Que la Tortilla Se Vuelva. What happened? Vanity is not a good advisor, nor is arrogance. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to write in this letter, the cost it will incur on my family. I'm sure some of my family members will be upset with me, and I can't blame them. That aside, I cannot continue to stay quiet, and it would be immoral to do so. I'm writing this letter after seeing tear gas canisters and bullets fired directly into live bodies from helicopters, against my brothers and sisters in Puno and Lima, right after your announcement of financing public works in Puno and a special envoy for economic growth. After 6 soldiers of adolescent age drowned defending your government from a false enemy, from the town that raised them from birth. It's the people against the people. You have completely lifted the veil off what really happens in this country. I can't see the humility and generosity of other members of our family that supported you and continues to support you out of their own generosity and solidarity. Today, they're subject to the grievances, insults, scorn, and harassment that only you deserve. It's enough. Our people are dying from bullets from your government. Time won't erase, dilute, or make people forget, nor will it strengthen your government. I'm sorry to tell you, it's not possible, and time only makes matters worse. Those who support you today, the right wing, the corrupt establishment and media, they will eventually abandon you. They already are. Recently, the media has repeatedly mentioned myself and other family members who I love dearly, insinuating we've been rewarded because of your position as president. It's not fair to us. It's not true, and we do not owe anything to you nor your government. I don't know if you will care that your brothers and sisters that still live in Chalhuanca and Cusco, now seniors, have been forced to leave their homes because of attacks from protesters and threats against the lives to them and their children. Dina, you have to apologize to Chalhuanca, to Puno, to Ayacucho, to the Aymara and Quechua people, to the memory of my grandparents, to your siblings, your nieces and nephews, to the mothers of the Peruvians that were killed, to the mother of the police officer who was recently burned alive, to the mothers and families of the drowned children in Puno, to the hundreds of Peruvians that have been jailed and sued unjustly, to the men and women who have been injured and beaten, to everyone. Please resign and give the country the possibility of finding a new path to peace and justice. Yorka Gamara Boluarte.